KWFM, South Tucson.
The views of this program are not necessarily those of KWFM, its management, or its sponsors. The host is solely responsible for the content.
On a mission given to me by Woody Shaw, Sunship, Dizzy, and Billy Higgins, dedicated to pursuing a piece of our cultural heritage through interviews with my jazz heroes, this is The Jake Feinberg Show. Welcome, everybody, inside the studios of KWFM 1330 The Star. This is The Jake Feinberg Program, and we're happy to have all of you along with us today. My guest today is an acoustic musician. You cannot pigeonhole his style because he's lived in all styles. Born in Hackensack, New Jersey, he grew up in the shadow of Inglewood Cliffs and Prestige Records, which at the time was capturing the sounds of the Reverend Gary Davis and Willie Dixon and Tampa Red. He heard these blues and lived these blues. His implementation of his own musical language occurred very early, when by the age of 16, he had already played the piano, saxophone, and mandolin. Being a student at NYU in the 1960s in New York brought him into jug band music and collaborating with old folkies like Jeff and Maria Muldaur. It was also during this time that he had a chance encounter with Bill Monroe that changed his life forever. My guest was a curious student, and searching for the high, lonesome sound, his travels took him to Appalachia and the Smoky Mountains, where the father of bluegrass was passing down his knowledge to a new iteration of musicians. It was during this time that my guest saw the growth of rock and roll and a definite switch from acoustic to electric instrumentation during his time in earth opera with Peter Rowan. My guest, along with the violinist Richard Greene, invented new acoustic music, playing traditional bluegrass instruments, but with jazz aesthetics and flavors. Old and in the Way embodied the rich ethnic fabric of America. Garcia, Kahn, Rowan, Clements, the different regional hotbeds of musical activity, experiential learning, and cross-generational collaboration. The same can be said for the Great American Music Band and Mule Skinner, and his work with Stefan Grappelli and Eddie Gomez, which epitomized the burning dog jazz. His current quartet features drummer George Marsh, who told me he loves playing with my guest because of the precision of the music and the opportunity for each individual voice amidst a group that is interested in listening and playing off each other. One of another kind, David Grisman, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show. How you doing, sir?
All right, how are you?
That's great to talk to you. I hope that intro did some justice.
Well, probably too much. You know?
I wanted to start by asking you, you lost your father at 10 years old, and he was a musician in his own right, yet he never got to see what became of his son. And I was hoping you could talk about the spirit of your father, and how did his death impact your early musical career, if at all?
Well, you know, when you're 10 years old, you don't really expect to, or I didn't, wake up one day and have your dad die. So, it just was a total shock to my being, and I just, the things my father gave me were, he was a very understanding dad and encouraging, and they're just intangible things that more so than specific like events. But he did instill in me a certain work ethic in regard to music. He more or less instigated me taking piano lessons when I was 7.
Right.
And used to stand there or sit while I was practicing and make sure I kept good time. And one thing I remember, for better or worse, is if I made a mistake, I always had to go back to the top.
Yeah. No, there were taskmasters out there, no doubt, and it sounds like your dad was one of them, you know.
But he had, he was an older man when I was born. He was 47 when I was born, and his professional music career had occurred earlier in his life, probably in the teens, 20s, perhaps early 30s, and I guess to support his family, and which he had a lot of brothers and sisters, he, went into other lines of work. And when I was born, he owned a toy store, actually, perfect thing for a kid, and then he owned sort of a soda fountain place, and then in his final years, he owned a hardware store.
Wow, I didn't realize he was. So he was a trombone player, though. But
He was a trombone player, yeah. And I remember hearing him play occasionally in the house, but it was a long time ago.
I ask it because I look at guys like yourself, and Bill Keith, and Ry Cooder, Clarence White, Richard Greene. I want you to talk specifically about music, your musical education, the idea of true self-expression, the idea that you guys had something different to say. And my thesis is that you guys had the mobility and the ability to move around the country, see different parts of the country, run into different guys from different regions, and that ethnic blending of music was contagious. I just want you to talk about where your individualistic style really came from.
Well, I have to credit a lot of my musical aesthetic development to one man, Ralph Rinsler, who I don't know if you're familiar with that name.
I've read enough. I've done enough research that you bring him up. So I was going to go ahead.
Well, he probably did more to preserve American folk culture in the 20th century than anyone. But when I met him, he was a mandolin player and a musicologist, and he also was a student in my mother's high school art class, and which she brought me into the class when I was 2 years old, and Ralph was 12. And, of course, I didn't remember that, but I really, after my dad died, I kind of lost interest in piano lessons. Went back and forth with that. But I was really, what caught my ear was, American popular music in the mid-'50s was kind of the birth of rock and roll, as classic rock and roll. People like Chuck Berry and Buddy Holly and Elvis and Little Richard and Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, and I really got hooked on listening to that music. And then around 1959 or so, all of that stuff kind of evaporated. Elvis went in the Army, Chuck Berry, I think, went to prison. Jerry Lewis got scandalized, and Little Richard found the Lord. And we were left with kind of a very vapid musical scene, like Leslie Gore, etc. A few years there in the early 60s were pretty bleak. But along came the Kingston Trio around 58 or 59, and that really caught my ear. There was something there that was a pure sound, and I and two friends in high school, junior high school, Fred Weiss, who I'm still in touch with, and Jack Scott got interested in folk music, and Jack Scott had an FM radio, and he kept telling us about this kind of music called bluegrass. And one day he came home with a record called Mountain Music Bluegrass Style. It was produced by Mike Seeger, and we came over his house, and he put on a particular track, White House Blues by Earl Taylor and the Stony Mountain Boys, and it kind of changed my life. And so shortly after, during that period, we wanted to form a folk music club in high school, and I went to my favorite teacher was my English teacher. Her name was Elsie Rinsler, and we told her we wanted to form a folk music club, and she says, well, gee, I have a cousin, Ralph, who's a professional folk musician. And we go, really? And next thing we knew, she had him come into my English class one day and give kind of a talk and played mandolin, guitar, and banjo, and that just blew our minds. And he took us under his wing. He was 27 years old at the time, and we'd go over his house, and he'd play tapes, live recordings of Bill Monroe, made a few years earlier in the mid-'50s, and it just turned us on to all kinds of stuff, recordings and playing the instruments, and Ralph was kind of a folklorist, and he rediscovered a musician who had recorded in the 1920s, Clarence Ashley, who was an old-time banjo player and singer, and he was going to Shones, Tennessee, to record him. And when he came back with the tapes, I was 15 years old, and I'm sitting in his kitchen listening to these tapes, and I said, who's playing that guitar on there? And it was Doc Watson.
Wow.
His first recording.
Wow.
And so I just, it opened up this world, of all kinds of stuff. He had a sitar. He turned me on to Indian music. One day in 1961, Sunday morning, I got a phone call. It was Ralph. He said, I'm going down to hear Bill Monroe at Rising Sun, Maryland. You want to come, So that day I got to hear Bill Monroe when I was 16, and it was just an unbelievable experience, meeting Ralph, and just the way he looked at music and art and everything. And the real kicker to this story is years later, Ralph passed away in 1994, but a few years prior to that, he came out to California, spent a few days at my house visiting, and during that visit, he told me that it was my mom who opened up his whole aesthetic appreciation of art. He said he couldn't draw or paint, but just the way she taught art, it was a life-changing thing for him. And that's something I was never able to get from my mom myself, because we basically had a combative relationship.
Was that dude, you grew up in an Orthodox Jewish household?
No, it wasn't Orthodox at all.
It was, okay, so it
was,
go ahead.
Minimally observant.
So the irony there is that he grew as an art. He grew his sophistication grew because of your mother's teaching.
Well, she was definitely a big influence on him, which was unknown to me all those years. But and he was, a big influence on me, and he, I more or less became a protege of his, and learned how to edit, helped him with. I even wrote some notes for him. He was a a real educated guy and real sophisticated, intellectual. Also a funny guy and a great mandolin player. He played in the first bluegrass band in New York City, the Greenbrier Boys. And he actually gave up that career as a musician to become Bill Monroe's manager, and he got more into promoting what he thought was real music than being a performer himself, and ultimately ended up creating and being the director of the Folk Life Institute of the Smithsonian.
Wow.
And also engineered the purchase of Folkways Records by the Smithsonian. And it did a lot of, help run the Newport Folk Festival. We formed an organization called the Friends of Old Time Music, which brought up traditional musicians to concerts. And I was on the inside track to all of that. So it was like, if you getting on the first floor with the Kingston Trio, I immediately took an elevator to the penthouse.
Well, it was like you said, it was a vapid time, but then within, you met Rinsler, and then the Kingston Trio came.
It was a great time for music that nobody
exactly
cared about really, or very few people were aware of. But
right.
A lot of these people like Mississippi John Hurt and Doc Boggs and Skip James and Gus Cannon, all these people were rediscovered and had made these incredible records, some of which were on the Harry Smith collection on Folkways, which is sort of a Bible for people like me, of recordings that were made in the 20s and 30s of real American folk music of various sorts, from blues to Cajun to, all the various country styles. So I just got a huge, continuous injection of that stuff coming from all kinds of directions. And of course, bluegrass music was in its, in a real vital phase, although it hadn't it was actually becoming really popular in the folk scare that was going on.
Can you talk about, did you say folk scare?
Yeah, well, that people have called it that.
You have to hit me to that,
you
because that was...
You have to watch A Mighty Wind to appreciate that.
Hey, okay, listen, I wanted to, if I was alive in in the early 60s or something, if I wanted to see Bill Monroe like you did in Maryland, it's the accessibility.
People like Ralph and Mike Seeger made that accessible.
But
they started bringing these people to perform in college concerts and Carnegie Hall. The same day I saw Bill Monroe, the opening band was a local band that included another amazing mandolin player who I saw for the first time, Frank Wakefield. And he became a big influence, and I actually, I was going to NYU, after I graduated high school, I went to NYU down in Greenwich Village in New York, and I was working for Israel Young, who had a place called the Folklore Center. He was kind of known as the mayor of Greenwich Village. And so I was in the midst of a lot of things, and really appreciated them all.
I guess what I'm getting at is the idea of, when I say accessibility, I mean that like Monroe was a leader that you were right next to him. I mean, it was intimate. It was so intimate. You guys were right there, and that's
right. The first time I saw him, it was a place called New River Ranch in Rising Sun, Maryland, that just had maybe 150 people there sitting on wooden benches with and there was another place called Sunset Park in West Grove, Pennsylvania. It was really only 20 miles away. And every Sunday afternoon, they'd have country music shows in these places, and a lot of them were bluegrass bands. And it was a very accessible, intimate setting. And even when they came up to the city, they played places like the Gaslight Coffee House, which probably held 60 people. Bill Cosby was the MC in the Gaslight. He was nobody.
Yeah, right. It was just a regular. And I think that is, this leads in. Let's we got a lot of music queued up for David today.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
let's get this track. We'll listen to it and come back and talk about it. Okay. Del McCoury and David Grisman, and that was something that you guys did, a jam session in the 1990s, celebrating your 50-year bluegrass friendship. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the fruition, how that friendship even got started.
Back to Ralph Rinsler, he brought Bill Monroe up for a concert at NYU early in 1963, and in the band at that time, playing his first gig with Bill Monroe was Del McCoury on five-string banjo, actually. And because I was like helping out and Ralph's friend, I got to meet Bill Monroe and the band, which also included Jack Cook, great singer, and playing guitar at that time. And later, he spent about 30 years being Ralph Stanley's bass player. I met Del at that gig, and then there were a lot of kind of like-minded kindred spirits, young urban kids, young adults that got interested in this music, and we would connect with each other at various events that we'd hitchhike to, or I met Peter Rowan in 1963 at the Union Grove Fiddlers Convention, even though he was from Boston and I was from New York, essentially, and also met during that time a banjo player named Bill Keith, who became a real good friend. And Bill Keith had innovated. He was from Brockton, Massachusetts, and anything but hillbilly. Hardly the typical candidate for being a bluegrass boy, but and he had innovated a style which has come to be known as the melodic banjo style, and got a job with Bill Monroe, and both he and Del McCoury showed up on the same day to play banjo for Bill Monroe.
Wow.
Apparently Bill, he wanted to ensure that he'd get a banjo player, offered the job to more than one. But fortunately for the world, Del McCoury is a great guitar player and lead singer, and that's the position he ended up with, and Bill Keith was the banjo player in that.
Yeah, I'm looking at this. I'm reading this. You guys played your first gig together in Troy, New York, at Rensselaer Polytech Institute.
That's right.
And again, I want to go back to this. These common themes that I've been going through with a lot of jazz, whatever. I hate labels, but musicians, Cosby. This idea of the intimacy. I mean, I would love to, if you could talk about the venue. I mean, was it a college cafeteria? Where were you?
Oh, no, it was, as I remember, a concert hall. I don't know how I got this gig. Somehow I got offered $200 to bring a bluegrass band to play this concert. And actually had originally called Bill Keith. And Del McCoury had I knew he had left Bill Monroe had been gone from Bill Monroe for a year or two. And before that, Do you have the date of that concert?
You guys first
I
met.
know it was in '66.
Right. And a date, no, I just venue only.
Yeah. Well, around that time, I also got a job with Red Allen.
Mm-hmm.
And in the band for a while was Jerry McCoury, who was Dell's brother, who was a great bass player. And, I basically called those guys up and hired them to play this gig. We got $50 a piece. But Bill Keith had to pull out of it, so my friend Julian Winnie Winston, who's passed away a couple of years ago, played banjo, and Del and Jerry drove up from, I think they were living in Pennsylvania, and they drove up and picked Winnie and I up, and we rehearsed in the car, basically, on the way to the gig. And played the gig, and I was doing some helping Ralph with some recordings, and he had lent me a Nagra tape machine, very fine Swiss portable tape machine, and I brought one microphone, I think it was an Electro Voice, and recorded that gig, and quite a few things. Tunes that were played are on a record called Early Dog. In fact, I was really inspired to be playing with those guys, and we had a great time playing that gig. And, of course, Dale was really singing and playing great, and the whole thing, came off. Was one of those great moments.
It also says here that the symmetry is incredible because you guys celebrated the arrival of your firstborns together.
Right.
Monroe and Ronnie. And so they're. To me, it's these are spiritual connections, but at the same time, as a leader at that time, I mean, were you just what were the qualities that you wanted that would make the group work well?
Well, I wasn't a leader in 1967.
Mm-hmm.
Although that was the year Peter Rowan, we were friends, in this, kind of urban bluegrass circle of, basically college kids who flipped out over bluegrass and other roots music, And Peter and I became friends, and he went to work with Bill Monroe after Dale McCoury, maybe a year or two after that. And we talked about forming a band with Bill Keith and Richard Greene, and but when Peter finally left Bill Monroe, he had it up, he kind of wanted to escape from bluegrass.
Right.
So, although I was ready to, I was always thinking I'd write a song called "Everyone's Played with Bill Monroe But Me."
It's true, though. I mean, because Richard.
And I got to play with Bill Monroe. I'm actually on a record playing bass on one song.
Really? What record is that?
Well, it's called Off the Record. It's something Ralph put together out of live performances.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you ever heard of Tex Logan.
No, the name does not ring a bell.
He's a great fiddle player who was also a kind of, brilliant scientist for Bell Labs in Morristown, New Jersey. He just celebrated his 80th birthday. And he wrote a song called Christmas Time's A-Comin' that Bill Monroe recorded in the 50s, and he used to play a lot with the Lilly Brothers and Don Stover in Boston. Anyhow, I was a great fiddle player from Texas, and ended up working for Bell Labs in New Jersey, and had a kind of a mansion out there, and once a year would throw an incredible party at which Bill Monroe and his Bluegrass Boys would be there, and he'd make barbecue for 60 people, and then they would come into his den, big, beautiful wooden room, and Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys would start and play a show, and then, Tex would invite all the musicians from all over, and it just turned into one big jam session all night long.
Wow.
And apparently during one of these, I ended up playing bass with Bill Monroe, and so I'm on this one track.
You were playing.
I also did. Peter Rowan was once late for a gig, and I played the first 3 songs with Bill on guitar. With me on guitar.
This is something that, with someone like David Grisman, who's, we're talking about a career that's spanned, really over the last half century.
Next year it'll be 50 years.
50 years. So I kind of like to do this with guests like David to play something that they may or may not remember. This is Can You Name That Tune? Okay. So let's come back and talk about it after it.
All right.
Sometimes we talk of poetry and white sailing boats off the island, of noble days and courtly ways. He has a mind for riches, a child he's bred and most carefully led, the kind some older lady can count on. Heirlooms and schemes color all his dreams, family frames his mind. He walks me home, holds the gate for me, and he says I'm not free, so don't wait for me. He says, lady love, dance for me while I play drum for thee. Sometimes we
All right, give it your best guess.
First I said that's not me because I thought it was Joan Baez, and I never recorded with Joan Baez.
Right, but then
I think it's a girl named Nancy something.
your app good. You want to try to? It's 2 first names. Nancy Michaels.
Yeah. Wow.
And it was that track is called White Devil, and the only I'm a obsessive vinyl collector, so I happen to anything that looks somewhat mysterious. I look at it and I say,
amazing.
Oh my God, there's David.
I don't even have that.
Yeah, well, no, I'm sending it out to Craig Miller immediately to get it transferred for you because there's you're on 2 of those tracks, and I mean, again, I wish. That track in particular was like, I wish you could have soloed for a lot longer, but it was just, I'm like, I don't...
mandolin, they never used to hire mandolin players for the whole album.
Exactly.
They looked at it as a color, and we don't want too much of that color, Whereas, like, bass players' colors and drummers' colors and guitar players' colors were fine. But, so, hey, that's fine. It's the life we have chosen, But, that's, you almost had me on that.
Well, then you got Nancy. That's pretty impressive. But, this is, the first person to use the electric bass in jazz was Monk Montgomery, 1953. And I bring that up because, Dog, I want to know how you... I
bet you there was somebody before that, because I've been to the museum in Seattle, the... what do they call it? EMP and there's a Gibson electric bass from like 1938.
You know what? Let's work on that together. I actually have. I've had this running dialogue. Some people say it was Dizzy, but I'm pretty sure Monk, in the jazz context, was playing the electric bass. But
he may have recorded, but I bet you somebody tried that thing out.
I'm sure. I'm sure they did. But my question is, I want to know how this convergence of acoustic to electric instrumentation and your experience in this, what we call a psych folk group, this earth opera, the idea of, like what you talked about with Rinsler, this appreciation for traditional music, and then sort of the beginnings of this loud rock coming in.
Well, I really never was wanting to do that, but I appreciated a lot of electric music, and still do. I mean, all the originators of, rock and roll, Chuck Berry and the Beatles. I dug the Beatles. I went to see the Rolling Stones the first time they played in New York. It just, it wasn't something that I particularly wanted to do, but Peter Rowan, he wanted to do something totally different and from bluegrass, and I had a mandocello, and I wondered what that would sound like electrified through a fuzz tone. So
where are the recordings of that stuff? That's what
Earth Opera. There's a few.
I got to get those because that to
I
me,
think it's out on CD. I think you can get that stuff on CD.
I need it on LP. Now,
okay. What? Just referencing, if you're an LP freak, you surely must be familiar with Village Music.
Is it a store?
It was a store for 40 years, and in my estimation, and I've been a lot of places.
Yes.
And I too, have sought out LPs for decades. This store had no equal. It was, coincidentally, a guy named John Goddard operated it in Mill Valley, California for 40 years. I mean, B.B. King used to have his bus drive up to this store, and he'd go in and buy $1,500 worth of records.
Oh, my gosh.
And the reason I'm bringing it up is because last night, my wife Tracy and I went to the premiere of a new film called The Last of the Great Record Stores that my children put together. My oldest son, Monroe, is the producer, and my daughter, Jillian, is the director. And we just saw this film that they've been working on for the past 5 years. And you'd love it.
Well, just as as a precursor, I was born in 1978. So
okay, you're just a young.
At this point, the things that I want to talk to you about are accessibility to your heroes, the venues, obviously your relationships. But to me, I can't deal with. I don't want to bag on contemporary music. There's still.
Hey, you know what?
Yeah.
I can't either.
No, Marsh told me that, and we'd have a spirited conversation. But the thing is, going back to that time where there was this immense amount of overlapping that was going on. And there was experimentation, and that wasn't seen as a risky thing because it was going to cost too much money. It was seen as, to me, it added colors. You talked about colors before.
We were all smoking dope, man.
Exactly. But but as far as record,
even Earl Scruggs, ate one of Bill Keith's brownies.
Right. And that's what I'm saying. Like it was not so so stratified. Not everything was stratified. I'm curious though, as this movie that Monroe came out with, what were so the Village was in there. What were the other ones?
Well, here's the thing. This guy John Goddard not only had the world's greatest record store, and I can't even describe this because every inch of that store was plastered with what I would call groovy shit. Posters. You can't imagine it, but they captured it in this film as best as a film could. And the thing is, he also started like he'd have I went down there, he had Cab Calloway in there signing autographs. He had a little party. I personally brought Sven Asmussen, Earl Scruggs, Del McCoury, Niels Henning, Orsted Peterson into this guy's store. And he also started having, there was also a club in Mill Valley called the Sweetwater, which got rebuilt, but back in those days, every year he'd have a Christmas party, and just a private party, and he'd get people like Ry Cooder or Elvis Costello and a lot of obscure, Charles Brown. What's this guy? Some real obscure rhythm and blues artists. And John Goddard was deep into rhythm and blues. And all of these performances that were just, parties for him, these people just came for him, he recorded them and had them videotaped. And when he decided to close the store, a bunch of artists like Bonnie Raitt and, he had the Collins Kids, had concerts for him and to celebrate this store. So all of that stuff got videotaped. And, a lot of this movie is just complete musical performances. The first gig that Jerry Garcia and I played together after we got back together was at his private party.
What's great is that, thank God, I didn't choose a Joan Baez album with a mandolin player that was not you.
That's what I first said.
I was so happy. I'm like, I'm playing somebody else.
Ralph Rinsler playing with Joan Baez, and the tune started coming back. This tune sounded familiar.
I got my 7-year-old daughter at home, and I listened to it 3 times last. She goes, "Daddy, I'm really getting tired of her voice." But I was like, for one time, I'm like, it's gonna fly because. And like I said, I'm going to send it to Craig because he can digitize it. But
I think that was produced by John Nagy.
You're right. He played on that. I think he played on that album too.
Yeah. Or if it was, I think it was the Warner Brothers.
But David, talk to me about the idea of all these amazing percussive instruments that you could intermix, like the vibes, things that have disappeared from live in some ways because of the loudness and the noise.
Don't tell that to Gary Burton.
I can't get a hold of the guy. What I'm saying is that there were these overlaps of mandolins and percussion and vibraphones, and it was, to me, it was just the word sophisticated is not the right word. It just, to me, it added so much dynamic, and you had to listen. You had to be able to listen, and it was, to me, it spoke to the people, who you were as people. It was sophistication. There was substance there.
I always I just like acoustic music. I like, sitting down with, in your living room, and that, to me, there's nothing like that. You plug into an amp. The amp the sound is coming out of the amp. It's not that close to you. It kind of, to me, I don't know, a violin or a mandolin or a guitar, somebody made that, it used to be a tree, several trees.
That's right. That's right.
And just the art of building these instruments is hundreds of years old, if not, 1,000, tracing it all the way back, and just the acoustic principles and, the fact that, no two snowflakes are alike, and you get all that personality and all that experience. Even, more than one lifetime is locked up in some of these instruments, And the fact that then you combine that with a human being who's got its own unique approach, how many violin players are there in the universe? You hear Stephen Grappelli play one bar, and it's him. You can't do that with an electric guitar.
Exactly. And
maybe B.B. King can, but even, I've heard some of B.B.'s finest work, I think, has been, he got a different sound because maybe he, I don't know. It, like that Indiana Indianola, Mississippi Seeds record.
I got that one, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that he had a different sound on that record.
You know,
And I would associate with B.B. King, you know. But I don't think, you know, I bet you he played a different guitar, but maybe he didn't. I don't know.
I read somewhere where you kind of got into jazz in the mid to late 60s, and I think you were on the East Coast at the time, and I wanted to know specifically the guys you were getting off on, and if you were able, you know, if you saw them live, you know, where you were seeing them and how it affected your mandolin playing.
Well, I just got into listening to jazz because, when I first started listening to it, I couldn't comprehend how it was put together. But actually, my friend Winnie Winston, he turned me on to my first quote-unquote jazz record, which I don't even know if you've heard of this, but it's a record called Baseball. You know who made that record?
I was gonna say maybe. Give me a minute here. Louis Bellson.
That's a good guess. But,
no, go ahead.
Just his bass and drums.
And who?
And it's a bass player's record.
Okay, who was it?
A guy named Francois Rabath.
Yeah, that's off the radar for Jake Feinberg.
Well, hey, you ought to check it out right away.
2 words or 1 word? Baseball?
I think it's 2 words.
Wow.
It was on Philips, and I think it's on CD. Is Rabbath, and it's not quite it. I mean, I heard it as jazz, but it's all this guy. He writes these original compositions. And it's mostly arco bass with incredible drumming. And it's just like nothing I ever heard, and still is. And it's incredibly, but it had a very jazz feel for me. It wasn't like classical at all. This guy's a total virtuoso, and there's multiple parts on the overdub. It's one of those totally unique things. And then I started listening to jazz. A guy named Bill Stevenson who played keyboards with Earth Opera, and some of the musicians that worked with Earth Opera. I started buying jazz records, and you know, somebody said, "Hey, Eric Dolphy," you know, so I got Eric Dolphy Live at the 5 Spot, Volume 2, and I got A Love Supreme. I kind of started at the kind of really avant-garde end of things. But then I discovered, Thelonious Monk and Bill Evans and Benny Goodman, and it just kept blowing my mind because everyone was great.
They all had something to say.
Everyone was unique, you know.
Exactly.
Nobody sounds like Thelonious Monk. Except that there's one guy who made trio recordings. What's his name? I'm sure you probably have heard of him.
Well, I was going to say I just found a record on Riverside, Clark Terry and Thelonious Monk with Philly Joe Jones on drums, and it's just listening to Thelonious play. I mean, the patience and the self-assuredness, and most importantly, the individualistic style, and it's just. It's palpable.
I mean, he's very similar to Bill Monroe, Thelonious Monk.
Can you explain that?
And a guy, huh?
Can you elaborate on that?
Well, you know, it's very visceral and very rhythmic in a certain kind of primitive way. You know, he's got that very funky kind of style. You know, not smooth and polished. That's very. Striking, you know, and very, no messing around.
Speaking of no messing around, we got
Herbie Nichols. Have you ever heard of Herbie Nichols?
Yeah, absolutely no. I don't own anything by Herbie per se.
He's the only guy that could. It sort of sometimes sounds a little like Thelonious Monk.
Did you ever make it down to these like slugs? You know, these, to see Sonny Fortune or Milt Jackson. I know you cover Bag's Groove a lot.
I saw the MJQ at I think The Bitter End.
Yeah, exactly. I love it. But that was a place that could have psychedelic, folk, jazz.
Yeah,
It was.
I saw Pete Seeger there too.
Oh, it's beautiful.
I always, Duke Ellington said it best. There's only two kinds of music, good and bad.
Chico Hamilton just told me that in our 15-minute conversation. He's 91. He's 91 years old.
Oh, that's amazing.
He gave me all he could for 15 minutes, and what he said was, "There's only one thing about music. It's either good or bad." And there's nothing.
Yeah.
It was
I always
unbelievable.
heard it that way. I mean, I knew that Frankie Lyman was great, and I knew that Ella Fitzgerald was great, and I knew that,
Louis Armstrong,
Lee Brothers
Yeah.
is great, and Jimmy Martin's great, and I mean, there's just a lot of great stuff. And then there's not so great,
That's right.
of which there seems to be a lot of. I mean, I don't want to insult anybody,
No.
but like I told my grandson last night, there's only one Elvis and there's only one Costello, and their names are Presley and Lou.
Wow. Well said. The thing is that I was hoping that you could talk just quickly before we go into the next piece of music here. When I talked to Richard Greene, he said that the bluegrass scene in Southern California, Los Angeles, was just a hotbed of bluegrass activity, and yet it was the same that was going on the East Coast. You described these private parties in Jersey and New York.
Mm-hmm. Richard, I drove with Richard Greene across the country in let's see, it was 1965, and he had been offered a job to play electric bass with the Greenbrier Boys.
Whoa.
And I kept telling him, man, let's just go to Nashville, and you can just go and work with Bill Monroe now.
Right.
But he'd moved to the East Coast, and he was at a lot of those. We were at a lot of the same parties. I met Richard out here in the summer of '65. That was the first time I came to California. In fact, the first time I laid eyes on Richard Greene, he was playing in a place called the Jabberwock in Berkeley, California, and I just spent 3 days driving nonstop across the country and walked into their gig, and these 5 guys were up on stage, and none of them whom I knew, and the banjo player was Herb Peterson, who I would ultimately, do a lot with, and they were just ending their set with Orange Blossom Special, and Richard ended with a big up bow, and all of a sudden you see Herb just clutching his eye. Fortunately, Richard missed him by about an eighth of an inch.
You almost took him out.
Yeah. So I don't know what that was, but Richard and I ended up jamming later that night, just the two of us, and playing some crazy music. I just think that was, the whole, once these sort of kind of quote-unquote sophisticated urban kids got interested in, bluegrass and old-time music, people like Roscoe Holcomb, there was some kind of connection there. I can't explain it, It was an emotional thing, but I also felt it. I mean, a lot of these people just appreciate, they just somehow knew that Charlie Mingus was great, and that there was so much great stuff, old, Blind Lemon Jefferson, Charlie Poole. I mean, there's just so much great American music and it got recorded, and we discovered it, and it's still there to be discovered. And it's great that younger people, even if you're not a kid, but it's good that younger people hear this and get interested, because that's the only way it'll survive.
For me, I thought you were going to say, you're not a musician, and that's true. I'm not. I'm a journalist. But the thing is that for me, I see it very clearly, David. I mean, you just explained it. You drove 3 days through the night to this Jabberwocky club. There were venues on.
I didn't go out to see that.
No, but what I'm saying is your education came from experience. You were on the road seeing this stuff. You could see, you were accessible. There were clubs everywhere to see this kind of stuff, and the ability to get around, just the mobility was much greater. So your learning was not in a bubble. It was not in a classroom. That's not to say you guys didn't have great educations, but Garcia.
Well, we had to go find it. I mean, because you couldn't nowadays. I mean, if you're in any kind of, you can go hear bluegrass music almost anywhere. Back then, to hear real bluegrass music, you had to go down south, unless, the occasional concert up north. But, I always dug hearing it in its natural environment, more or less, which would be, like a bar in Baltimore.
Exactly. At the Cantab Lounge in Boston or something,
Yeah, my kid plays there now.
Of course. I want to, speaking of Richard Greene, this is another surprise for David. We'll see if he can peg the session here. We'll come back and talk about it.
All right.
Same note. Let's just run through it once. Let's just do it once.
I love it too. That's classic. Where do you think?
Wow, that must be. I don't know who's. I never heard that before.
Yeah, good. This is why we do the show.
I know it's Bill Keith and Richard Greene.
Well, that was Sweet Georgia Brown from a great American music band session from, I believe, March of '74. Garcia's on banjo.
No kidding.
Garcia's on banjo. I can get that.
Wow, I thought it was Bill Keith for sure.
No, and that Richard.
I thought it was great, but
no, it's incredible, and I love it. You guys are starting to noodle at the beginning, and Richard's like, "Let's just play it." You guys just burn it, and then.
Wait a minute. Really?
Yeah, and then what Richard told me in the interview I did with him, he goes, he thought that was Garcia's best banjo solo he'd ever heard, which is interesting because you thought it was and that's the thing is like. That
was the best banjo solo that Bill Keith ever played. Yeah, it had more spunk than he normally might have.
Well, it makes sense. Because I just
did Richard have that?
That was foisted on me by Richard Greene. Yes, so I have some more.
It's not released though, is it?
No.
Too much.
No, too much. And. If you would, David, humor me and my generation into, all of us collected on Rounder Records, the classic Old and in the Way album, and
Round Records.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. I have a white label promo, and
all ready to start a label called Roundest Records.
And I'm looking. I just picked up an album today on Rounder Records, Willow Avenue in Massachusetts. David Grisman. Rounder album. So
okay, yeah, you just got that today?
I just got it today with...
I ought to feel that in about 20 years.
I don't have that queued up right now, but I wanted to ask you, how was it that Vassar, in Old and in the Way, how did Vassar come into the picture?
Richard Greene was playing some gigs with us at the time, right. And we were going to do a tour on the East Coast, their first and what turned out to be our only tour. And Richard, at the time, was putting together a band of his own, and he said he wouldn't have time to do that. Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, so, we were, it was Jerry Garcia. He had, all these, concert hall, good venues, good paying gig. And so... we're thinking, who can we get, And Pete, I think he had Vassar's phone number. I don't think any of us had ever met Vassar Clements. So we said, hey, and Jerry said, hey, call him up. Just hired the old boy.
That's right, because Richard was going off on, he was doing C-Train kind of stuff, and then...
This was after C-Train.
This was, so he was, and so Vassar comes in, you guys never met him, but there was just immediately it just kind of fell into place. What was the dynamic there? Because you and Peter and Jerry, John Kahn, you guys had known each other. So what was that like?
Well, John Kahn, we had just met John Kahn, and I knew Jerry since 1964. Pete had never met Jerry. I took him up there because we all were living in Stinson Beach, California. Actually, I moved there first, and then Jerry bought a house there, and then Pete moved there. Wow. And I just said, hey, want to go up? Jerry loves to play bluegrass, So we, but, when you learn a form like bluegrass and you've been properly educated in it and have an ability with it, not that Old and in the Way was, was a little different but it was something we were in control of, We were in a good stage in all of our careers, and of course, Vassar was already a master. He had already made classic recordings of Bill Monroe and Jim and Jesse. He was one of the architects of that music. But music has got cumulative results, It's something that you can actually put 50 years into, and you'll get 50 years worth out of it, or 30 years worth, or 20 years worth. So at this point, we were at about the, 12-year mark or something. And
right. I like the way you look at it, though.
You know, it was inspired. I mean, we put in a bunch of perspiration, and you know, if you've been in Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Boys for 2 years, and were the lead singer with Bill Monroe, I mean, you're gonna sound good, you know. We all, you know, we just had a good, you know, vibe going, you know. We all kind of enjoyed doing what we were doing. Jerry was real, you know, he's like a real positive type guy. Plus, he had real work. I mean, you know, it was at a point where, you know, $150 for a gig was a lot of money.
Absolutely. And,
you know, I would go down and play a night at Paul's Saloon for $19 with just some band down there. Just so, you know, it wasn't unpleasant, you know, making some, you know, and also drawing a crowd. I mean, Garcia had this audience already. And, I mean, that's really what it takes to have a band, is a gig. And a good gig and a good band. I mean, what more could you want? But we wanted more.
Of course. You know, I often listen to some of the you know, someone was cogent enough and smart enough to tape some of these recordings at the Family Dog and the Boarding House and places like that. And everybody got a nickname from Garcia. He gave you your nickname. You know, talk about going back to '64. The first time you met Jerry how that happened.
Well, it happened in the parking lot of Sunset Park, where it was at a Bill Monroe show, and you know, I mean, the main thing was going to hear Bill Monroe, and Jerry was on a kind of cross-country pilgrimage that summer to hear bluegrass bands, and I heard that maybe he applied for the job with Bill Monroe and didn't get it, or at least wanted to do that. Anyhow, we, you know, kind of connected and stayed in touch, and the following summer was when I, you know, made that trip out to California for the first time, and we had a mutual friend named Eric Thompson, and he came out in the winter of '64 and to New York, and we started playing together. He's a guitar player, and in fact, we went down to the Union Grove Fiddlers Contest in April of '64 and won the band contest.
Wow.
And then the '65, I decided to visit Eric and Jerry and all the musicians out in kind of the Berkeley, California, Palo Alto, you know, the Bay Area. Because there were these little pockets of these, you know, lunatics like that were interested in all this music and could play. And so they started meeting each other. There was the Boston contingent, the New York contingent, the Philadelphia contingent, the Chicago contingent, the Berkeley, California, and L.A.
I call that regional hotbeds of activity.
You're familiar with this thing called the Map of the World?
No.
That a guy named, you ever heard of Rick Shub?
You're educating me now. Go ahead.
Well, Rick Shub was a banjo player and also an artist, and he and this guy named Earl something did this thing called the Map of the World, and it's like consists of Berkeley, you know, all these places I just mentioned, and it's just tons of names written on. You should see if you can find it on eBay.
Yeah, I absolutely. You know,
very cool. Earl Crabb was the guy's name. They were, you know, and it wasn't just music. You know, like Jerry Garcia turned me on to Hieronymus Bosch.
How did that? That guy. What was Garcia's? Who had a between you and him? How many records did you guys have? How intense were those collections?
I don't know. We never counted them. You know, I think it was more or less common interest in certain things, and and probably we both probably were seekers in that we, once you hear like Django Reinhardt or Dave Apollon, then you're on the search. Like, Jethro Burns told me, I asked him who he thought the best mandolin player he ever heard was, and he said Dave Apollon, and I'd never heard. I actually had sort of noticed Dave Apollon albums in Sam Goody's, but because they seemed to be like poppy, just from looking at them. Right. I never bought one. And then, of course, once Jethro said that, I bought. They were already out of print, but I started searching for them and finding them, and I would I took out an ad in the Musicians Union newspaper, any photos, information, etc. on Dave Apollon, and I got several letters. Some guy sent me a picture, and I actually got a letter from his son.
Wow.
And hey, seek and ye shall find. Once I heard about something cool, I wanted more of it. I wanted to know all about it.
Can you talk about guys like Ralph Gleason, Phil Elwood, other people that might have chronicled? I think part of the issue going on today also is just the lack of coverage of music the way it was in local rags and papers. And I'm curious as to when you went to Berkeley in '65, who were those writers that even would write stuff up in local papers that would give you guys some nice publicity and alert people to stuff that were curious about learning about this stuff?
Well, I didn't. You mentioned that. Oddly enough, I lived next door to Ralph Gleason.
Get out of here.
Yeah, in Stinson Beach, yeah.
Dude, his spirit has been driving me on this path. So, I mean, that's great.
I got the Ralph J. Gleason Award from Jerry.
Unbelievable. I know Jerry was a Gleason fanatic. I'm sure you both were. The guy was a total culture. He was a freak.
Yeah. Well, and there was Robert Shelton in the New York Times, I don't know. I guess there were people that on the journalistic side of things that saw value in this stuff, which was obvious to and I imagine some of them are still around, but it's probably not as good,
Well, we have.
these great. I was fortunate enough to. One thing about it all is, the terms are too general now, but bluegrass, you could still hear all the original guys that created that. And, jazz, maybe a lot of them were gone, but I still got to hear Dizzy Gillespie. I stood in lunch line with Dizzy Gillespie at the North Sea Jazz Festival in 1984, and had a conversation with him. He told me his father had played the mandolin.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Over a tuna sandwich. Who would have ever thought that?
We were online.
Yeah. No. We brought this guy up before, and it's just one more final piece of music for Mr. David Grisman. Let's hit this track.
Right, you got me on that last one, boy.
No, you'll get this
Jerry, one. Hey, I thought it was Bill. I kept saying, that's Bill Keith. That's Bill Keith.
David Grisman Quartet. Take it away, man.
Quintet, but
Quintet. Thank you.
Yeah, that's called "Waiting on Vassar."
Exactly.
And I wrote that sitting in a chair at a friend's house in Brookline, Massachusetts, waiting to meet Vassar Clements to play the first gig with Olden in the Way.
I got to ask you. I'm very familiar with I have family that lives in Alston, so I know what Brookline is now. What was Brookline like then?
It was kind of calm. We were.
So you're Olden in the Way. You're going to play at the Orpheum, or where do you have any idea where the gig was?
I think we were playing at. might be wrong on this. I think we played Jordan Hall.
I'm going to have to do some research on that. It was 73?
Yeah.
And so Waiting for Vassar, I'm reading off the back of the Rounder album here. Like you said, he says, I was just sitting in a chair, just waiting for him to show up, and this little tune popped out. Or at least the first part. But it's that visceral fire, the burning, the crowd at the music hall. I mean, I've never been to the music hall, but people were on the edge of their seats, just the way I was at Saunders Theater.
Well, it was quite a band, too, and, so a good arrangement,
Mike Marshall, Todd Phillips, Tony Rice, Daryl Anger.
There was some, like, if you notice there, Mike Marshall plays both fiddle and mandolin. He picks up the fiddle, and they play this arranged twin fiddle, I mean, this just didn't occur.
It didn't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah, no, I mean, I had a great band, and I still have a great band, and I think I have things that I can utilize great bands for.
Well, David, I know you've gone through the whole pot of coffee, and you've been on the phone for quite a while. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of homework that I need to do, stuff you've given me, and there's a lot of stuff from your career that we didn't cover, and I hope we can revisit it at some time in the near future.
Anytime. It's been a real pleasure. I'm really, no one's ever tried to, I've done a lot of interviews, but no one's ever, given me the blindfold test on my own stuff. And you've got some unique approaches there, plus you've done a lot of homework. I've just always been into kind of the offbeat great things. Great thing is there's great things that everybody knows is great, and but I like to find things that I never heard of that are great, and there's a lot of them.
Well, you can bet I'll be digging like a madman to find some more for our next interview, David Grisman. Thank you, my friend. Thanks so much.
Of Lars Gullen?
I'm going to go back and write. No, I have a lot of homework to do.
Here's another one. Yeah, get Lars Gullen. Gullin.
Listen, this one's for John Kahn and Jerry Garcia. David, thank you, my friend, for taking the time.
Sure, thank you. It's Jake?
Jake Feinberg Show.
All right. Hey, I've got a Jake, 1-year-old grandson, Jake.
Beautiful. So we'll be in touch. And thank you for taking the time. And this
sure, thank you.
And I'll get you a copy soon. And that Nancy Michaels is on its way to Craig Miller.
Great.
Talk to you soon, man.
Hey, thanks.
All
Jake.
right.
Bye.
This is the Jake Feinberg Show. KWFM 1330, The Star.
Sun don't shine, well, don't mind. Drink this wine, just a while. Said even just a night. Even just a night. Said